Hello, this week we are looking at Mission to My Neighbour in our series on God's Mission, My Mission, number 7. And we think about who is my neighbour. That's very much the question for ourselves as we look. And you remember the scenario there, it's there in Luke chapter 10, when this lawyer, maybe we could put it that one, and that's not talking about secular position, but one who studies religious law, very important in Jewish society, and he comes along and says, so what do I need to do to get eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what do you think the law says? And you get that dialogue, and then after Jesus says, loving God, love your neighbor, then he says, well, who is my neighbor? And that was a very common kind of question in the society of the time, because you had many different peoples, and who exactly did you need to treat as a neighbour? You certainly shouldn't have to treat Romans as your neighbour. That was one thing. I'm sure that came into the things. And the Samaritans, who were, quotes, heretics and so on, and all these other people, the pagan nations around you, you have to treat those people as neighbours or not. Or who was my neighbour? Somebody from a distant town, a distant village, or just people who live really close by? And as Jesus answers that question, everybody is stunned, because he comes up with the story of the Good Samaritan, and for them that was an oxymoron. You can't have good and Samaritan in the same phrase. It just didn't make sense, because Samaritans were bad. But here you have a Good Samaritan in contrast to who? Well, you have the priest who goes by, and then the Levite who goes by, doesn't help the injured, wounded man at all. And the Good Samaritan comes along and binds up his wounds, takes him in, puts him in an inn, a place to stay, and says, here's some money, look after him, and when I come back, I'll pay whatever else is due. What an amazing story of somebody who shows unconditional love and support for somebody that he's not supposed to be caring for at all, because of that rift between them, between the Samaritans and the Jewish people of the time. And the question then comes to us, in what way do we also do exactly the same kind of thing? And we need to be able to take that mission to the world and to explain who Jesus is to people who are not our neighbours, not of our own language or people or race. Who is my neighbour? Jesus says, anybody who you meet. That's your neighbour, and that's the person you should be caring for. Some quotes for this time, when we really look at it very seriously. Dan Wakefield: the message of Jesus is summed up partly in the Sermon on the Mount, and partly when he begins his ministry and quotes the passage from Isaiah, I've come to set free the prisoners and restore sight to the blind. These are your neighbours. And certainly his mission is also to bring hope. It was to heal people, to befriend the outcast, the person who people didn't think you really needed to do anything for. And we read some other interesting statements there, but we haven't time to look through all of that. But on this very cold and frosty morning, I want to encourage you to think, what can I do for my neighbour? Not just the person who lives next door, but everybody that I meet. And may God bless you as you study and come closer to Jesus as a result.